What's up, and welcome back. Now, if you read this week's newsletter, and if you didn't, go back and read it, you already know our framework for a workout, right? You warm up, you hit a little bit of strength, you do some pump work, tag your core, maybe even work in a little bit of power. And that's the blueprint for how all of my athletes turned busy working professionals have begun structuring their training. And I left something out of that newsletter on purpose because every time I try to talk about exercise selection and how to actually pick the programs and exercises that fit your body, I start to realize that, man, that could be a 20-page paper on its own. But we're going to take the next 20 minutes and go through how to actually do that, right? So today we're going to deep dive on two things: the posterior chain, aka the backside of your body, and your knees, which the knees are probably the thing I get questions about the most. What do I do with them? How do I make them not hurt? So on and so forth, right? And I promise you, by the time we're done, you won't look at how you select exercises the same way, all right? So think about what your body looks like right now, right? You get up in the morning. If you're like me, you do your workout, or if you're an afternoon worker outer, you're going to do it after you listen to this. But in the morning, you get up, you get in your car, you sit. You go to the office or up to your home office and you sit. You have meetings at work, you sit. You eat lunch, seated. You drive home, on your ass, right? You're on the couch, on your ass. You go to sleep, and then you wake up and do it all again tomorrow. There's a reason people say that sitting is the new smoking, because we're doing it for 16 hours a day, and then we're sleeping for 8 hours a day. So there's not a lot of time that we're actually spending up and on our feet. Now think about what your sport demanded of you years ago. We're talking explosive hip extension, big powerful glutes that could fire on command, hamstrings that could decelerate your body when you're running at full speed doing a down and back, right? Maybe you even had a back that could absorb, brace, or even transfer force through your entire system in fractions of a second, meaning you were an absolute machine. It was the fittest, strongest, most powerful your body has ever been in your life. And you spent years building this machine designed to move. And now you've spent a decade or more sitting in a chair, slowly turning all of that off. And that's the gap that I want to close today, of you finding that middle ground of maybe not getting back to what you were 20 years ago, but also not being on the other end of the spectrum on your butt all day. And this is where I spend a lot of time with my clients, is them coming in, having been active, but now gotten into adulthood and just sitting on their ass a lot of the day. So one of my clients who came in, she was having some low back stuff going on. She was what she considered active. She was up with her kids, running them around. But really, it was the same story. She drove her kids to practice, sitting in the car. And then while the kids were at practice, she sat on the bleachers watching the kids do their thing. And there were a few switches that we made that helped, that weren't actually like workout based. They were more of like a habit based thing, and it helped. But what we focused on was that backside. And because she was spending so much time seated at work, in the car, at kids practice, all I had her do was get up and take laps around the court or the field, because kids play all the sports, while the kid was practicing. Because she wasn't coaching. She was just there kind of watching and dicking around on her phone. And so by getting her up and having her get more actual activity in, it unloaded the back and opened up those hips. And then the second piece that we added was, okay, after you do a couple laps, pop back up on the bleachers and do some glute bridges. 3 sets of 10, which I know it's not the most scientific way of programming stuff, but 3 sets of 10 paired with some walking on these hip thrusts really took some stress off of her back and got her to a point where not only was she getting stronger in the gym, the back pain itself was almost eliminated. And it's just because you added more space for movement there at the hip. And so I tell you this story because sitting does a lot to an athlete's body. All right, so let me explain a little bit. When you are seated, you are putting essentially a stretch on your glutes, sometimes your low back, and you're putting your hip flexors, which are the muscles on the front of your body, in a shortened position. And so having them being short is not necessarily the issue. Having them being shortened and weakened is actually the problem. So when they're short and weak, they feel tight, which when your hip flexors get tight, sometimes that can tilt your entire pelvis forward, putting a little bit of an exaggerated curve in your low back. Now, when your spine is in that extended curve, right, that's a decent amount of low-level stress from just sitting or standing, right? And your glutes are supposed to be the muscle group that balances that tilt, because the 4 actions of the glutes, which this will be way more information than you ever need, is to abduct or open the leg away from the body, okay, to externally rotate or rotate that leg away from the body, to extend the hip or to actually open up that hip, and to posteriorly tilt the pelvis, aka balancing the anterior tilt that you get from your hip flexors. Okay, so if we're thinking about this, if you're short and weak on one side and you're stretched and weak on the other, the pelvis is just going to find its home. And typically that home is that anterior tilted position. But now remember, we've talked about this. Tilt isn't necessarily the thing that causes pain. It's not being able to get into other positions and staying stuck. And part of that counterbalancing act, there's a term that some people use, and it's not actually accurate. And let me explain. So I'm sure you've heard glute amnesia. You got folks saying, oh, your glutes forget how to fire. Well, that's not actually correct. Your glutes are just weak as fuck because you're not using them, right? And here's the thing. You develop these glutes over years, and now sitting has just made them weak and kind of flabby. So if you're like, yo, I want that badonkadonk, you're actually going to have to work those buns rather than just sitting on them. And because we're all athletes, whenever we feel weak or unstable, your body doesn't collapse. We compensate. We find other places in the body to pick up the slack because your glutes just can't handle the load, right? Your quads pick up for your hamstrings, and your body finds a better way to make the movement happen, especially if all the parts and pieces aren't working together. And as we start talking about compensations, we're going to center this whole talk around the glutes because the glutes tie into the upper back. The glutes also tie into the knee and how that knee functions. So we're going to focus on kind of glutes and knees today. And I just want you to keep in mind, compensation isn't just weakness, right? It's actually your body's way of being resourceful. But every workaround ends up having an expiration date, and that expiration date for most of us tends to happen somewhere in that 35 to 45-year-old range. We are the ones that have worked really hard. We've given ourselves an extended break, and then when we go back to do something, we actually break. And there's a way that we can avoid that, right? So just the friendly reminder here that our posterior chain and training it matters so much more than it would for any other group, right? It's not just about having round, voluptuous buns, right? That's an additive effect, right? It's a nice outcome that we can get from actually training that backside. But it's more about restoring the system that has been keeping you upright and moving at a high level since you stopped competing, right? So we want to make sure that you're able to do all the cool stuff that you want to do outside the gym. And this is one way to do it, okay? So we have to be smarter with our exercise selection and building our training around this posterior chain, right? So quick note on what exactly this posterior chain that I keep referring to is. And it's basically the back side of your body, right? So you've got the front side or the anterior set of muscles that typically are responsible for pushing, right, things away. And then on the back side, you've got the muscle groups like your glutes, your hamstrings, your back, your traps, your delts, everything that helps pull you into that upright position, right? And it starts at the base of your skull and runs all the way along the backside of your body down to your heels, right? And in sport, we use the backside of our body for almost everything. Whenever you took off for a sprint, that's the backside of the body. Jumping for a rebound, that didn't come from your knees. If it did, you weren't jumping very high. That actually comes from the backside, right? The posterior chain. Every time you had to hit the brakes to change direction, or you went to tackle somebody, or any of that, the posterior chain was the thing doing the heavy lifting, right? And in the gym, average people tend to train what they see. They train the mirror muscles. That's your biceps, your chest, your quads, your abs, right? And maybe calves because they're a little bit easier to see, right? That's the front side. Everything you see in a mirror, that's what's looking back at you, and that's what people train. And if you're only training what you see in the mirror, you're building a house or a body without a foundation. The backside is what actually allows you to train the front side even harder. And that backside, the posterior chain, is the foundation. Now, for my former athletes here, right, you spend your time in flexion, right? Even me right now, sitting here at my desk, recording this talk, I'm bent over my desk, right? Hunched over my screen. You're in your car, you're driving, you're on a call, you're sitting and watching Netflix, you're eating dinner, right? All of those things, you're putting a stretch on that backside. And if you put a muscle into stretch long enough, it's going to be lengthened. It's going to be what we call in the training world inhibited, meaning it's not going to be able to contract as well as it could, right? And at the end of the day, right, training your backside isn't just about performance anymore, right? We've talked about that. We're giving that up. Now it's about pain management. It's about longevity. And it really, at the end of the day, it's about us being able to move well when we're 60. Now, how many of the coaches that you watch on TV move well at 60? How many of your teammates who are getting older, just like you, are struggling to move well, especially on the women's side where we've had a ton of ACLs, a ton of hip stuff, right? We've got a hurdle to clear before we even get to older age. I mean, think about your coaches. What were your coaches like when they were in their late 40s, 50s, early 60s? How did they move? Were they hobbling around? Were their knees kissing and touching each other, right? Part of this is the price we pay for being such good athletes. But now we have to train in a different way so that we can continue to live the life that we choose to live. So let me get off of that soapbox just for a bit. I'm sure I'll come back to it. But let's actually talk about how I select exercises to load the system correctly. And let me be clear, this is going to be more than, well, let's just do some deadlifts. Now, I like deadlifts and I think they're cool, but they're not for everyone. And there's certain other variations of exercises that we can use that work for your body. And what I want you to think about while you're choosing the exercises you do in the gym. Okay? So the fundamental movement pattern that we're going to talk about is the hip hinge. And it's exactly what it sounds like, right? You're taking your leg, you've got your femur on top of it, and you're rolling that pelvis forward, right? So you're hinging at the hip, right? Your hips move back, Your spine stays in a neutral position. You get a nice stretch on the glutes and hammies. The knee doesn't do much, right? In this pattern, the knee actually only bends because the hips slide back. And if we were to think of this in technical terms, in a squat, you're getting well past 90 degrees of hip flexion. In a hinge, you're only getting about 15, maybe 20 degrees of knee flexion, which can mean a lot, especially if you've got some achy knees. And we'll get to those guys later, right? So in this movement, most of the stress is placed on those glutes and hammies, and that's exactly where you want it, okay? And especially, as we'll talk about later, for those of you with cranky knees, this distinction between the hip hinge and the squat is huge, right? And so, like I said, we'll come back to the knee in a second. But the first movement I want to talk about is the Romanian deadlift. And if you're not sure what Eastern European thing I'm talking about, is just the RDL. So you've probably heard it said one way or the other. Some people also call this a stiff leg deadlift, but there's some slight differences in that. And this RDL could be called, and I'll go ahead and make this proclamation, it is the single most important posterior chain exercise that I program for my clients. You hinge at the hip, you start at the top with load, you lower that load, you stand back up by squeezing the glutes and hamstrings and keeping your back in that neutral position. It is a pure hinge, right? It doesn't require a bunch of knee flexion. It actually gets you into and out of the positions you spend the most time in, and you do it under load. So you're building some capacity to manage that seated position a little bit better. And this is the number one exercise that helps hamstrings not feel tight, because every single client that I have worked with over the last 20 years have said at some point, yeah, but Jenny, my hamstrings feel really tight. They actually are just weak. We've taken the tension off of them by being in a seated position, just like I'm in right now. And the stronger we can make those overstretched muscles, the better they perform. Okay, so when you're performing the RDL, you want to push your hips back until you've run out of room. And by this point, you should feel a stretch in your hamstrings, a little bit of a stretch in the glute, and then you squeeze everything to stand up from that end range. Okay? This can be done with dumbbells. This can be done with kettlebells. It can be done with a barbell. It can be done with a landmine, right? The way that you load it actually doesn't really matter as much as you're loading it more aggressively than not, and you're giving it a good 5 to 8 reps per set, meaning you're taking it to that reps in reserve of 1, or like a 8 to 9 out of 10 on the intensity scale for that number of reps. Okay, so the key is progressive overload, and I know that's a term that I've talked about before. Okay, so there's your first one. Let's talk about the second one, and this one might be the most popular movement on the internet today. That's the hip thrust. And this one, especially if you're a bro and you do it in the gym, people tend to look at you like, what are you doing? But for the most part, is widely acceptable for women. But the hip thrust is probably the most elite movement for glute development. And it's also one of the most knee-friendly movements as well. Now, in this one, so let's set this up. You've got your shoulders on a bench, your feet on the floor, your knees bent. Okay? You can place a weight. Typically, I'll start my clients with just body weight, but you drop your hips to the floor and then you squeeze your glutes to extend. Now, this one's going to be much more glute focused because when you bend your knee, you're taking the hamstring out of it. Okay, so hamstring will do some work, but it's kind of the inverse of the RDL, where in the RDL, the hamstrings are doing most of the work. In this hip thrust, the glutes are doing most of the work, and the hamstrings are the assistance muscles. Okay, now one tricky thing here, if you've probably done a hip thrust, you probably tend to feel it a lot in your hamstrings. The trick to getting it out of the hamstrings and feeling it in your glute is, hold on, listen, you ready for this? Take your big toe and press it into the ground. Your big toe has a direct line to your glute from the nervous system point of view. So when you press that big toe into the floor, it signals to the glutes, oh, hey, I need to extend, and you feel it a little bit more, okay? Now, the nice thing about this exercise is you can load it. You can put a barbell across your hips. You can use a dumbbell. You can use a sandbag. You can use bands, right? There's a lot of ways to put tension into the system. But the things that it avoids for most people, which is helpful, is that you avoid deep knee flexion. Yes, the knees are bent, but you're not directly loading them. You're also not directly loading the spine. So we're not loading the spine from the top down. We're loading it from the front, right? So this provides a direct glute stimulus without crushing the other structures that tend to support this movement and this action there at the hip. And for someone who's dealing with some knee stuff and or some back stuff, this is pretty much a gift for you, right? So not only will you get Insta famous by filming it and putting it on the Instagram, but it's also going to feel really good. So while the hip thrust may look and feel kind of funny, it will do more for your back pain, your posture, and that athletic look you're chasing almost as much as any other exercise in the gym. So you can go ahead and laugh now, because I know I make a lot of butt jokes, but you'll thank me later once you give this one a shot, okay? All right, so there's movement 2, the hip thrust. Movement 3, and this one's going to be kind of a few different ones, right? These are all of the single leg variations, and if you have followed me on Instagram, which I highly encourage you do, because I post a ton of example videos, I really enjoy unilateral work. Now for me, unilateral work tends to be a lot nicer to my hips and knees than traditional squats and deadlifts, okay? It's just one of those things. In this way, I've actually flipped what I do as the big lifts and do more split squats, more single leg RDLs, more kickstand positions, step ups, all of that stuff than I do regular squats and hinges. And I think it's important, especially for our group, to understand almost everything we did in sport was single leg, right? When you run, you go from a single leg stance to a no leg stance because you float, and you're doing probably 80% of the things that you do in a single leg position, right? You planted to cut, you pushed off to play defense, right? Everything kind of biased to one side or the other. And your body has a dominant side and a non-dominant side, right? Like, I'm right-handed. Can I shoot with my left? Yes. But to train things at the same time means you're able to hide some of those discrepancies from left to right, especially when we're talking single leg work, right? And single leg work will expose those discrepancies pretty quick. And I was just listening to a guy speak on the left to right imbalance and the risk of ACL tear. And it's pretty interesting. The stronger you are from left to right, the closer those two numbers are, the less likelihood you have of actually injuring your knee. So when we train with both feet planted, typically we can hide what's happening. But as soon as we open up and go one leg at a time, right, we're training, then we start to train the stabilizers around the hips and knee. We train the foot a little bit better. And these are typically movements that a lot of programs skip. So now the specific exercises here would be a single leg RDL. And I really recommend using a hand support, because the single leg RDL itself can be pretty much a circus trick of trying to hold a weight in your hand, stick one leg out behind you, lower the weight, come back up. It requires a lot of balance. So I would much rather you use your offhand to hold on to the back of a bench or a rack or anything that's stable, to help make the movement a little bit smoother. It's not cheating, it's just taking advantage of your ability to load that movement and get stronger. I don't need you to work on your balance for the sake of working on your balance. Improving your balance will be a byproduct of getting stronger in these single leg positions. Okay, so we've got single leg RDL. Reverse lunges work really nice, especially when you have a little bit more of a forward lean. So not a forward curve of your spine, but if you put your chest lean forward over that front knee as you step back, you're going to get a little bit less of a knee bend and a little bit more of a hip bend into that reverse lunge, which will help protect the knee on the front side and get you into an open hip on that stepping leg on the back. Okay. And then the other single leg thing that I really like that opens up the inner part of the hip is a lateral, some people call it a lateral squat. I call it a Cossack squat. But basically, take your feet really wide and you sit your butt down to one side, to the right or left, and then come back up to the center. Sit down, right or left. Now, the thing here is there's a lot of different ways to train unilaterally, but you have to start somewhere, starting with the basics. And I don't recommend walking lunges. Walking lunges might actually be one of the best ways to blow up your knees if you haven't done any sort of single leg training in a long time. So stick with the single leg RDLs, stick with the reverse lunges, and start to incorporate things that work side to side rather than just straight ahead, because now you're going to build some tolerance in those tissues that you haven't used in a bit. Okay? And then the last piece here, this is less about a single exercise and more about a guideline or a rule, right? So anyone coming from a heavy desk lifestyle, which is most of us, unfortunately, when you are thinking about, all right, it's Monday, it's International Chest Day, I'm going to do a bench press, and I'm going to do all the bench presses and chest work. Well, that's cool, but that's just compounding the position you spend the most time in. So it's cool to hit a bench press. I'm not knocking that at all. Please go do that. But the thing I want you to consider is that for every rep of that bench press that you do some sort of pulling movement, okay? Meaning for every rep that I'm moving something away from my body, I need to do 2 reps of pulling something towards my body, okay? So that could be rows, that could be pull downs, that could be face pulls, band pull aparts. Like there's a bunch of different ways to do that, right? And the reason here is all of the chronic sitting that we do, and even me, I just caught myself on the camera here doing this, is that we are sitting in a forward flex position with our chin poked out and our shoulders kind of rolled in. All of these rows and pulls will help offset that. And remember, the posture isn't the bad thing. It's the amount of time you spend in the posture and not being able to get into other postures that actually weakens your upper back and your delts and all of that stuff. So if you keep pressing without doing any sort of pulling, you're just reinforcing the posture problem that you're beginning to develop, and you're setting yourself up for some shoulder aches and pains. Okay, we're essentially pulling ourselves back into balance. All right. So I think as we have talked and beat up on the backside, let's go beat up on something else, right? Let's do the deep dive on the knee. And I know in the article this week, I mentioned a couple people, some very famous people that are dealing with some knee stuff. You've got Dawn Staley, you've got Kenny Smith, you got Candace Parker. Those were the 3 I think I pulled into the article to just quickly use as an example. But take a look at how they walk around, standing on the sidelines, talking trash to Shaq on TNT. Like what these guys, or these and ladies, played at such a high level that their knees paid the price for it. But I can tell you, just because I know some of their trainers and coaches of these coaches and celebs, that they are still working on keeping their knees in good health. Molly Benetti is the head strength conditioning coach at the University of South Carolina. Those guys, that staff, that coaching staff, does team lifts. So not just the players, But the coaches and support staff do a workout together. They're working on a lot of these things. So I know Dawn is working on those knees. Candace has her own trainer that is still working on that knee that she's had repaired several times. Kenny Smith, he's having to chase his kids all around because they're playing basketball now, right? And so he has to train in order to keep those knees from just being completely degraded. They're already arthritic, right? You can tell from the collapse and the way that that's set up. But the thing is, they're doing something about it, and they're able to maintain the current position and level of their cartilage rather than just letting it go and possibly even making it worse. Okay, so I wanted to spend a little bit more time here on the knees because this is the thing that I get asked about more than almost anything else, right? And I think a lot of times we get this as an industry, we get this wrong for our population, okay? The reality is, for many of our peers, our former athletes, right? Those that played sports, especially sports that involved high volumes of running, lots of cutting, lots of jumping, or even contact. So these are going to be like your primary sports. Olympic sports, a little bit different. There's other issues that tend to happen, but your primary ball sports, right? Most athletes are going to have some degree of degenerative change in their knees. That's just the nature of the beast. You wear them down, you don't allow for appropriate recovery time, and now that you're not training, the body takes away what it doesn't need, or what it perceives it doesn't need, and that leaves you with cartilage that's possibly thinner than it should be, right? Joint spaces that maybe have narrowed or collapsed, maybe some old ACL repairs that, you've got some scar tissue built up, or if you had a meniscus surgery, like those tend to take some of that natural cushion away, because that's what part of the job of the meniscus is to cushion that knee for compressive forces. Now, this is not catastrophic. And it doesn't mean you can't train hard. You just can't be a dumbass, right? Your knees don't actually need to be babied. They just need to be trained intelligently. And that's a big difference, right? All this functional training BS of standing on a Bosu and juggling tennis balls, like, that's cool. And that's a skill that you're developing. But when we're talking about being able to navigate the real world, being able to step up, step out, catch ourselves if we trip, like all of those things, like the knee is an important part of that, and training intelligently and training with that reason to be strong, also to look good, is the key here, right? So let's walk through a couple of these exercises that will help with, you being able to train that joint effectively, but also, avoid some of the aches and pains that come with it. But first, I want to make sure that you guys understand the difference of compression and shear, okay? Because these are, we could talk about torque, but we'll just focus on these two right now, right? So if we think about compression, when you compress something, you're squeezing it together, right? So compression is the vertical load on the joint, right? So when we're standing, there is a inherent vertical pressure coming down from gravity through that knee joint, okay? When there's balance from left to right, your knee joint is stacked, okay? When you get a little bit of degeneration, then that knee joint, right, maybe teeters or totters one way or the other, okay? Shear is the horizontal force. So we've got vertical force going straight up and down. And now we've got shear, which is the up and back force. So here, and if you've lost an ACL, this is actually one of the tests that they do to see if you've got stability in the knee, okay? Compression in reasonable doses, right, is generally pretty tolerable and actually good for your joint health. So even as you're going through flexion, there's still a vertical load, okay? And that vertical load and compression of the cartilage with subsequent appropriate recovery actually drives nutrients, drives blood into that area and helps with the regeneration of cartilage. Shear is where we can get into a little bit of trouble, but also a little bit of shear isn't a bad thing, right? It's going to happen. As you squat, that femur, which is the top leg bone, is going to shift forward as the knee flexes and then, pulls back as it extends, right? So deep squats actually are better for the knee than shallow squats, mostly because there is a shear force component at the deepest portion, but the load is not actually on the knee. The load is actually shifted back to the hip. So when we talk about squatting, my goal with my clients is always to get them to at least thighs parallel to the ground. Because if I stay in that top range of motion, I'm actually putting more stress on that knee than I really want. Same thing goes with leg extensions. If you only stay in the top half of the leg extension, you're straightening that knee against a ton of shear force. But when you get into the deeper ranges of motion, right, it can create a little bit of blood flow. It can actually help with the lubrication of that joint. Now, these deep ranges of motions may seem a little bit scary. That's okay. There's nothing to be afraid of here. What we want to do is not dive in automatically with load or force, but we're going to work you into those deeper positions over time. Because the muscles are the things that support the joint, they're going to adapt pretty quickly. The cartilage, which doesn't get a lot of blood flow, is going to take a little bit more time to adapt to the change. So with my clients, we'll start kind of working closer and closer to that thigh parallel to the ground. Now, some of them we may take a little bit deeper, but if we take them deeper, we're not loading as heavy, right? Because there's other things to consider, not just the knees, and even on some lunges, right? So yes, we're out of the two-legged stance and into more of that stepping movement, but still, forward lunges can put a lot more shear stress on the knee than a squat can. And so squats are actually something we use every single day. On the lunge side, which we already talked about this for the glutes, we're actually going to use the reverse lunge variation a lot more than we will a forward lunge. Now, I'll mix in a forward lunge every once in a while, especially if someone's going to travel and spend a lot of time climbing stairs or hiking or walking. I will actually program in forward lunges more often when there's a special occasion, but for the most part, we're working on that stepping back motion rather than the stepping forward motion. Okay. So I talked about the reverse lunge. Okay. I really like the box squat, and not the traditional box squat with the barbell on your back, but really holding any other sort of weight and sitting down and tapping the box, not a full seat, right, where you're unloading everything, but you're just going down and using the box more as a target. Okay. So it's a quick touch. I feel it. I stand back up. This is where we start to retrain that pattern, and it gives us a good tactile cue to say, you know what? Stop here, stand up. Stop here, keep tension on the muscles, use those muscles to stand up, right? This doesn't allow for the knee to go anywhere that it doesn't feel comfortable, and you start to build your quads without forcing a weird range of motion that your knee just isn't ready for, okay? And I really enjoy the goblet squat, especially with an elevated heel once we pass this target phase, because then it drives more knee flexion without having to rely on an ankle that maybe doesn't move. And I know my ankles don't move. A lot of athletes' ankles, after just being taped up and braced for years, they just don't move as well. So then you find these little tweaks of the main movement to make it work that much better. So some people call the goblet squat a little bit overdone in the functional training world. but in reality, that's a good starting point for most people. Okay. Now, the leg press is where a lot of people start. And I think the leg press is good for higher volume work. I don't like the leg press for low volume, really heavy weight. And the reason is you're taking your hips and hamstrings out of the equation and really focusing on the knee. Okay, so you could do the leg press or you could do a leg extension. I like either of those if you want to use machines. Another nice thing is you limit spinal compression. There's no upper body or trunk loading portion of this movement, so it really does isolate the quads, and you get a little bit of calf in there as well too, but you can really isolate the quads and get away with increasing leg strength until you're ready to get to the full standing movement, right? So depending on where someone is where I would actually start them relative to more of the squat or a leg press. And sometimes the damn leg press is too heavy to do anything with as well, so then we start with the leg extension. So it's really about finding the right entry point here than just forcing traditional exercises on you, okay? And then the last one, or actually, sorry, I got two more. The idea of a terminal knee extension. You're like, what? Is that where I take off from the airport, the terminal? No. We're talking about the last few degrees of straightening your leg, okay? So it is a small targeted movement. I typically use bands with this. It's called Spanish squats, Spanish lunges, Spanish split squats. Usually if you see the word Spanish in front of anything for whatever reason, this is focusing on this idea of terminal knee extension. So again, it's the last few degrees of you being able to straighten your knee. But when you put the band behind your knee, it does something interesting. It gives you almost a little bit more space in that knee to work, but then it also gives you something to press back against rather than a completely vertical load. And very rarely do we load that horizontal shear plane of things in this way. So this just forces that VMO or that teardrop muscle right above your kneecap to work a little bit harder, and that one is especially important for stabilizing the knee and the kneecap as it all kind of comes into that patellar tendon that runs over the kneecap and attaches at the top of your shin bone. Okay? A lot of times a weak VMO can be part of the culprit for a knee tracking inward under load. Now, there's other reasons for that, but having a strong VMO is never a bad thing. So again, you can do this with a band attached to a rack, okay, and the other end of the band looped behind your knee where it's pulling your knee forward. You can do it in squats. You can do it in lunges. You can do it in split squats, right? It's just a nice way to create a little bit of traction in that knee and get a nice pump. And now the last one is probably something that's a little bit more fringe. It's something that I use personally, and I know several of my friends do as well, and that is blood flow restriction. Now, blood flow restriction is a modality that was made to be used in the physical therapy arena, and it's of course been adopted by the fitness world like anything else. But essentially you're going to use a cuff or some sort of band to restrict blood flow out of the working muscle. And the reason you do this is because it builds up metabolites or it builds up waste product, and the muscle has to get much more efficient at using the resources it has. But that chemical signal also signals a muscle building response. Okay, so you're building up those metabolites under light load and high rep, and you're signaling, hey, I've built up all this stuff. You need to get bigger and stronger so that you can deal with this more effectively. Okay, so you're not really using much weight at all. And I know it sounds strange, but for folks who are coming off of any sort of joint replacement, or any sort of rehab where muscle preservation is key, this can be a compelling use case. And so I think it's worth noting if nothing else. If you want to learn more about it, just let me know. Okay. And I've had some clients who have built their quads back from pretty much nothing, where their knees were just in so much pain that their quads had atrophied, using something like blood flow restriction and then progressing them up through the exercises I listed above, right? The knee itself in the beginning couldn't handle much load at all, and the muscles didn't care how much load we used. It just needed the signal. And so we go from building to now strengthening, and a lot of that works, okay? So that's what to do. Let's quickly talk about what to avoid. And we'll go through this quick, okay? Because I've already kind of mentioned a lot of these, but maybe don't even avoid, but what to be careful with, okay? The first one being deep knee flexion under load, okay? So just know that building up to knee flexion past 90 degrees can be a good thing, but you need to earn your way into those positions, okay? So I want to make sure with every single one of my clients before I go full knee over toe that they can manage it with body weight before I ever start to load it, okay? And knees over toe is actually the position, that's the goal position we want to get to anyway, because without that, we tend to overload the posterior chain. And while we are trying to load the posterior chain, overloading it is not the goal, okay? The other thing to ease yourself into is high impact landings super early in your journey, okay? We do want to incorporate power training. We can do it at the beginning of a workout, at the end of a workout. We can use it for conditioning. But for someone whose knees are a little bit more achy, I'm actually going to start you with isometric holds, meaning I'm going to get the brain and muscle to start working together better to create tension before I put you into any sort of jumps. Now, if you're ready and you can manage it, fantastic. But if not, we get the same output, minus the breathing and sweating stuff, from isometrics than we do with more of the plyometrics or the moving movements, okay? If we take a little bit of time and work through the isos, your tendons and joint structures actually adapt at a much faster rate rather than, pun intended, jumping right in and you flaring up an old injury that puts you down for a couple weeks, okay? So with that, the final piece of this to just be aware of, we have a higher pain tolerance than the average person. Don't ignore your pain signals, right? Pain during a movement, not discomfort, not the burn, not the pump. I'm talking like pain. Like this is something is wrong. It's information, okay? This is your body telling you that something's wrong with the angle, the load, the position, the range of motion you're working in. And while we're really good at pain, that's not the goal now, right? We're not trying to be virtuous in our ignorance of pain. It's that we are trying to build a body that supports everything we do outside of the gym. And so when we look at putting this all together and you start saying, all right, what exercises am I actually going to put into my training session? I want you to start with what you can do, not with what you used to do. If you used to do power cleans, don't care. Do you ever need to do those again? No. Can you get the same thing from a kettlebell swing? Yes. That's what I want you to do. I want you to focus on what you're currently able to do. And your workouts should be based on your body right now, not the one you had, not the one you're going to be when you're 70, who you are and what your body is able to do right now. And you got to remember, this is probably one that's been sitting for the last decade, maybe two, depending on your job. Maybe it's one that has had a surgery or two. Maybe it's one that gets stiff in the morning and takes a little bit of time to warm up, right? These are the bodies that we're training, not the one from your highlight reel on YouTube, right? And for the posterior chain, you're going to anchor your patterns around your hip hinge pattern around the RDL, single leg RDL, reverse lunge, and you can maybe even throw in a good morning in there if you'd like. Like one of these as your primary strength movement more often than not. Then you can pair it in with some upper back work. You can hit that hip thrust we talked about, right? Now you've addressed two of the biggest gaps that most of us have in our workouts in one pairing, right? Throw some more unilateral work, some split squats in there for some pump. You could even hit your reverse lunges, step ups, split squats, any of that in ranges of motion that you have control over. And now this is where you can start to close the gap between your left and right side, right? And then for any sort of isolation work at the end, you can do your VMO, your Spanish whatevers. You can do your hip thrust here as well for higher reps. You can do some clamshells, like things that get the glutes going, right? And all of this starts to create a much more stable environment for the knee itself to function in, right? A strong knee controls the hip, a strong hip controls the knee from the top down. A strong foot position, which is what you'll get in your single leg work, controls it from beneath. And that knee, which is a middle child, right? It takes care of itself when those two areas are strong, okay? So if your knee's acting up because it's being that brat of a middle child, you kind of want to look at what's happening above and below it. And if you can fix those, the knee typically fixes itself, okay? So listen, I know this was a lot. This is much longer than I planned it on being, but there was a lot of information I felt was important to cover. And as I got going, I was like, oh shoot, there's even more information that I wanted to cover. But I think for now, this is a good start. And I want to be honest with you about something, right? This conversation is the kind of thing I could spend an entire coaching session on with one of my clients, right? Because exercise selection isn't just about picking stuff from a menu, right? I'm all about watching how you move, understanding your history, and often adjusting in real time, right? And that's the part you can't get from a podcast or newsletter, right? You can get the principle, but who's there to hold you accountable and who's there to coach you, right? Who's there to tell you, here's what your squat should look like, or here's why I'm not giving you that movement yet, right? That's coaching. That's you getting feedback and being able to go apply it, right? So if any of this landed for you, right? If you listened this far and thought, God, I needed this, but I'm not really sure how to apply it to my body, then let's talk. Right? I mentioned in the newsletter that I've got a couple one-on-one openings this month. I'm not going to put it up anywhere. Really, this is just for you all. And if you're in this community and you're ready to stop guessing, hit reply on the newsletter, right? I want to give this information out for free, but when it comes to certain things, you just need the direct coaching. So hit me up, send me a DM. We'll have a real conversation about whether or not it makes sense for you. I just want to make sure that you have everything you need to live a high-functioning, very successful second season of life, okay? Because at the end of the day, you earn the body that you have by doing something hard. You earn the career you have by overcoming something hard. And you deserve a program that honors that and pushes it forward. So that's a wrap on this one. And if you found it helpful, as always, share it with somebody who played and who probably hasn't thought about their backside other than how it looks in their jeans since their last practice. I'll see you next week.